Okay, we're making our way through the Ten Commandments. As I've pointed out before, we're actually, according to the counting of the Sefer Chinuch, we are actually, there are 14 of the Ten Commandments. Today we are going to be learning the commandment dealing with honoring one's parents, kaved et avicha v'et imecha, which in the Sefer Chinuch's counting is number 33, and as you all know, it follows right after the Mitzvah of Shabbat. Maybe we'll start with the Sefer Chinuch. That's on the all Hebrew source sheet. On the left-hand side, that's the middle.
Excuse me, may I just ask, what is the topic?
Honoring one's parents. Honoring one's parents. Honoring one's parents. Kivud aveim. I don't know if it's a different microphone than normal. Honoring one's parents.
Honoring one's parents.
Oh, honoring one's parents.
Yes, okay. So the middle of that source sheet on the left-hand side, the mitzvah is lekaved ha'av va'em, as it is written, kaved et avicha v'et imecha. The fact that in modern Hebrew you can simply write it as kaved ha'av ve'et ha'ima without even the et, we're going to see that there's a significance to that in a moment. And the explanation of this can be found in the Gemara in Kedushin. And what exactly is included in honoring? It means to feed, to give drink, to give clothing, to cover up, to help them come in, to help them go out. That's the honoring portion. We know that in the Torah it also speaks about mora, or awe, or fear, and there are additional mitzvot in that regard. For example, not sitting in your parent's place, when your parent walks into the room to stand up for them. There's a whole long list of what it entails to honor one's parents. Practically speaking, what's involved. In general, the financial cost of honoring one's parents is borne by one's parents. In other words, if your parents have an estate, you don't have to go bankrupt in order to honor one's parents. You're allowed to take from the estate, but in terms of time, you're fully obligated in order to do those things. Of course, there are exceptions to every rule, and there are exceptions, for example, if it becomes too burdensome and it's affecting your own parnasa, your own family, in terms of the time requirements, you are allowed to relinquish some of the obligations in that regard. We'll see some more of the specifics in just a little bit. What I want to start off with is a series of disagreements that the Minchas Chinuch has with himself about what exactly is entailed in this honoring. So in that same source sheet, but you'll look off to the sides, he raises a number of different possibilities, a number of different questions. For example, if you look in the right-hand side, the first one, Dinei HaMitzvah, in terms of the laws of this mitzvah, Ayin Rambam, if you look in the Rambam, in the Hilchot Mamerim, you'll see, and he then goes on to ask us the question, or tell us it includes, Bichlal mitzvah, included in this mitzvah, Gam ken eshet ha'av b'chayai aviv. The wife of your father, while your father is alive. In other words, if your father remarries for some reason, either through a divorce or through a death of your mother, he remarries. While your father is alive, you have a mitzvah now to honor one's step-parents. And he then goes on with a little of the details, what's involved. He then questions, when the father passes away, does that mitzvah of honoring one's step-parents continue? And there's actually a machloket. Some say the mitzvah nevertheless may continue on a rabbinic level, meaning it's on a deraita level, he argues, to honor one's step-parents while one's father, by the way, vice versa. Your mother also, if it's a stepfather, you have the obligation to honor your stepmother or stepfather. It's a Torah obligation, says the Minchas Chinuch, while the father or mother is alive. When the father passes away or the mother passes away, do you still have an obligation to honor one's stepmother or stepfather? And the Minchas Chinuch brings down that yes, you have a rabbinic, it goes one level below, but he also points out, and the Chaye Adam says, no, you no longer have an obligation to honor one's stepmother after your father has passed away.
Who's that?
The Chaye Adam. And so the question just to start thinking about is, why? What might be the difference? Meaning, how do we conceive this mitzvah of honoring one's parents that it first of all extends to honoring one's step-parents? And then, is there a difference in our conception of this mitzvah if we say that the mitzvah continues after the parent passes away, or it doesn't continue after the parent passes away, right? I would say, for example, why do we have the obligation to honor one's step-parents? It's part of honoring one's parents, right? You honor someone who your father or your mother has fallen in love with, so when they've passed away, no longer you have that obligation. But he says, no, you still have a rabbinic obligation. Yeah, you're going to...
No, you might have stepbrothers and stepsisters.
Exactly. He also... So he lists all the other variations. Do you have an obligation of honoring one's grandparents? Yes. Okay? By the way, he suggests it's the same source. Your obligation to honoring one's grandparents emanates from your obligation to honor your parents. They would want you to honor their parents. Also, your stepbrother, stepsister, yes, although there's a machloket. Also, one's own brothers and sisters, right? I mentioned, by the way, of course, that this is my oldest daughter's favorite Gemara about the Torah says, et avicha ve'et imecha. That's extraneous. You could have just said without the et altogether, and certainly you don't need the second et. So why is the et there? So there's a machloket actually about the teaching. Some say the et is to teach us that you're supposed to honor one's step-parents, and some say no, it means you're supposed to honor one's brothers and sisters, older brother and sisters. And then there's a machloket even within that. When we talk about older brothers and sisters, what might you be able to say? Do you have an obligation of honoring just the oldest brother? Or is it anyone who's older than you? What might be the various, and that's what, by the way, if you look on the left-hand side, there's a few other discussions in that regard. The second paragraph, now we're still back to the right-hand sade, speaks about the Ach HaGadol. And look, the Ayin Shama, look there, in Brachot, the second line, Achicha HaGadol, your larger, your oldest brother. And a few lines down below there, you have the Kavod Achiv is like honoring your father, meaning you honor your oldest brother like honoring your father. And then at the very bottom, it speaks about, does this exist just like a step-parent, only while the father is alive? You have the obligation of honoring your oldest brother.
While they're still married, what if it's divorce?
So that also then becomes, what I'm going to try to suggest on all these, maybe I won't necessarily go through them all inside here, there's a whole series of possibilities. And in each case, there's a machloket. We have an obligation to honor one's step-parents, but what happens when the father or mother passes away? Do you still have that obligation? You have an obligation to honor your oldest brother. What happens when the parent passes away? Do you still have that obligation? Because you might say, I'm honoring my brother because my brother is my father's son or my mother's son. And as parents, you all know there's nothing that gives a parent greater joy when the kids get along. And so therefore you have an obligation to honor your brother because of your parent. Well, once your parent passes away, if the reason why I have to honor my brother is to please my parents, now, all bets are off. Now I can go and have all those fights I wanted to have my brother all these years because it's no longer a concern. Yeah.
Well, that's the question. You have to honor your mother and father after they're deceased.
So that's another one that he actually speaks about. Very good. So do you have to honor your mother and father after deceased? As you might imagine.
Do, then it will filter down to the rest.
Correct. And so it's a machloket. Though there are those who say you absolutely have to honor, it continues on, in which case all of these, as Jerry just said, continue, right? Nothing is separated. You continue to have an obligation to honor one's step-parents, right? Because they would still want you to take care of them. Your older brothers, so that still exists. And indeed, that's probably the tradition, right? Most of us, I would assume, feel we have an obligation to our parents, even after they pass away. That's why we, do some type of thing special on their yard site. Maybe we do charity, maybe there's different things that we do. But there's machloket. Some say no longer. Do you have, you have an obligation, a general obligation of speaking of the dead respectfully and the like, but you don't have a specific obligation for honoring one's parents anymore after that, at that time. There's another machloket that enters into this picture that he speaks about, which is the machloket of, do you have to honor only your oldest brother or any brother that's above you? We have a case, for example, where we have Zvulun and Yisachar. It says they would not speak in front of, meaning one of the mitzvot that we talk about is the mitzvah of, like for example with one's parents, not speaking before them, meaning if they have something to say, not to contradict them, not to suggest that we know better than them, or something along those lines. So we have a midrash that says Zvulun and Yisachar did not speak in front of Shimon and Levi, as if they were honoring them. What's the problem with that? Shimon and Levi are not the firstborns. So from that midrash it suggests you have an obligation not only of honoring one's oldest brother or sister, but honoring anyone who is older than you in that regard. So that's also a machlok that
It's
exists.
also the older sister. And in
Yes.
that case, they had the same father, different mother, but sometimes it's the same mother and different father.
Correct. And those also, by and large, you have obligations to honor them as well. Again, all these questions are, you always have to be nice to people, right? That's always a mitzvah. The question is this an additional obligation, right? You always have to honor your let's say, your brother. But does this emanate from one of the 10 commandments, right? Because that also then has issues of the significance of the mitzvah and the obligation and the like, yeah.
Do you have to stand up for your brother?
So there's a good question. So he actually writes, in this regard, he says, wait a second. He begins to go through the logic and says, I have an obligation to honor my older brother. It emanates from my obligation to honor my parents. But one of the mitzvot in terms of honoring your parents is you're not supposed to use their first name. Right? When you speak of or about your parents, you should never say just their first name. You might say, like, Mr. or Doctor or Rabbi, Josh so-and-so. I mean, you can use the first name, but you should give them some type of honorific. That does not exist, he says explicitly, with regards to your older brother or older sister. You're allowed to use their first name. So therefore, it's clearly not the same mitzvah, and it has a different variation. So one of the ways I thought of perhaps understanding all these different machloket, there's two different opinions, basically. But what's the underlying principle that would lead you to paskin one way or the other? So if you look on the right-hand side, the whole right-hand side of that same source sheet, still inside the world of the Minchas Chinuch, it's the third section down on the far right of the thing. He raises another question. He raises a question of tshuva. And he says as follows: a mitzvah tasehi kekol ha-mitzvot shebetorah le'inyan tshuva. Right? Like all the mitzvot in the Torah, you have a mitzvah of doing tshuva. By the way, he's already spoken on the other side about tshuva in the instance of a parent who does wrong. This is a question, it's actually a fairly popular question, unfortunately, that I get is, what happens if your parent does something wrong? Do you still have an obligation? It's come out a little bit in terms of abuse, that parents abuse the child. Does the child still have an obligation with regards to the parents? The general law, by the way, is on one foot that if the parent is not a great parent, you have an obligation to honor them. If the parent is defined as a Rasha, okay, and there's different definitions of how to get a Rasha, then no longer do you have that obligation. That's according to most opinions. However, there are some who, and this also is another machloket that comes up, that says you still have an obligation to honor one's parents, even if they're a Rasha, although it might be different, meaning you have an obligation to do everything you can for your parent, but because it would be dangerous for you or for your family, you don't have to do it physically. You can sort of do it from a distance. That's the more extreme opinion. The more mainstream opinion is you no longer have this obligation at all. What's that machloket about? Yes.
If your parents don't keep kosher and you do, you don't have to eat in their house. You don't have to
Right, but you still have an obligation. That not keeping kosher doesn't give them the classification of Russia. So you still have all the obligations. And certainly if they told you you must eat non-kosher, right, you don't have to listen to them in that regard. But so there's a technical reason of why you may not have to do something. But you may still have to go to their house and sit in their house and help them and everything, even though the house is not kosher or the like. So he continues this conversation about tshuva over here now. Yes?
Does it matter whether the parents' bad behavior is directed at the child or if it's societal, like they're in jail after this?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Again, for the person who would say that you have an obligation regardless, right? So it wouldn't make a difference at all. And even it would add to it. Because you're not personally in danger by being in their presence, you would still have the obligation to... Right. You still have that, meaning one person says you absolutely do it. The other is that person may not have the definition of a Russia. You have to, that's a whole other class. I knew what you meant. Yes.
You said something previously about once the parents are in
Yes.
that you don't have no obligation.
Well, it's a machloket.
Okay.
Meaning, what he brings down that one side, and I think it's the majority opinion, is that you do. You have to continue to honor your parents regardless. But there's others who say, no, you have an obligation while they're alive, and then that streams down, right? You have an obligation while they're alive. When they're no longer alive, you no longer have an obligation, in which case you no longer have an obligation to the step-parent, no longer have an obligation to the brothers, the sisters, because all of those obligations emanate from the father or the mother.
What to do any of the Shema and stuff like that.
Nachon. No, right. So, but that right.
Yeah.
So that also exists, but it wouldn't then necessarily come down to your obligations to your brother, let's say, because again we're talking about specific, actual halachic obligations, not just being nice. You have a specific obligation of honoring, let's say, your oldest brother, right? If he gives you advice on certain topics, right, you're obligated to follow them along. There's 3 areas which you're not obligated to follow your parents' advice. With regards to, they're considered too intimate or personal. One is marriage. If your parent has a disagreement with you over who you should marry, if they have a disagreement with you over where you should learn, and if they have a disagreement with you over whether or not to move to Eretz Yisrael. Those 3 exceptions to the general rule of if your parent otherwise tells you to do something and it's not against Torah, you have to actually follow them. So it's a fairly broad mitzvah. Going back to the Minchas Chinuch, so I just mentioned he raises the question of tshuva of the parent, right? What happens if the parent is bad, and then he says, but if they do tshuva, does the mitzvah then come back that you now have an obligation to respect them? And he talks about that a little bit. And now he asks the question of, do you have to do tshuva? Okay, let's see what he says, because I think this teaching of the Minchas Chinuch helps us to classify what all these debates really are all about. He says it's a mitzvah, say, like all mitzvah, to do tshuva. And of course, tshuva, mechaperet. When you do tshuva, it atones for the sins. Mikol makom, ani mesupak. But nevertheless, I'm a little bit in doubt. Lefi shemuvar b'Rambam, as it's brought in the Rambam. Go one down. Da averot sheben adam lechavero. Say mahani tshuva v'lo yom kippurim ad. It's cut off a little bit. Shiyirtza et chavero. In general, in the world of tshuva, according to the Rambam, if you wrong your neighbor, your friend, and you do tshuva, but you don't appease your friend, Yom Kippur doesn't work, and tshuva doesn't work. You actually have to include and apologize and appease your friend as well, right? Those are mitzvot ben adam l'chavero. If it's a ben adam l'makom, you only have to do tshuva. So what's this relationship, do you think the Minchas Chinuch is going to say with regards to honoring one's parents? So he goes on and says, what is the mitzvah of honoring one's parents? Is the mitzvah ben adam l'chavero? I have an obligation to my parents because they're human beings, they're special human beings, but I have an obligation to them. Or is it a mitzvah not to my parents, but rather to God? In which case then, let's say if I wrong my parents, of course to do tshuva in general, I have to appease them. But I violated this particular mitzvah. So now, if I violated this particular mitzvah, do I have to appease my parents, which I would do if it's a mitzvah ben adam lechavero, or is tshuva alone enough? If I do tshuva with God, then I'm at least okay with vis-a-vis this mitzvah. So what is the Sefer Chinuch? I mean, the mitzvah is kind of raising here as a possibility. He's saying there's two ways of looking at this mitzvah. One is reason we honor our parents is because it's, in the same way, the reason why we honor our brother is to honor our parents. The reason why we honor our parents is to honor God. Or is it, no, we have a specific relationship to our parents as our parents. That machloket and how you decide and how you fall down on it will either create a problem for you or solve a problem for you. It will solve a problem for you because when the luchot were given, we say that there are 5 on each side, and the 5 on one side represent the mitzvot ben adam lemakom, and the other side is mitzvot ben adam lechavero. And the one that causes a problem for everyone is how to deal with this mitzvah of kivud av'eim, because kivud av'eim is on the side of ben adam lemakom, but it appears that it has to do with honoring real live people. So if you say that this mitzvah is really only about ben adam lemakom, you have no problem. But if you side, and this influences all your other decisions, you're ben adam lechavero, right? If it's ben adam lechavero, I have an obligation to my parents, so once they pass away, I no longer have that obligation to them. So I don't have an obligation to their step-parents and to the brother and so forth and so on. So then it should be on the other side of the column. So how do we understand its placement?
Is your father not your father after he died?
Well, you can't have let's take a different mitzvah, for example, tzedakah, right? You can't give tzedakah to someone after they passed away. So in this regard, if you view honoring as specifically related to the person alone, you can't give them that honor. You could do other things that honor them. I know it's like a slippery slope because we do see that you have a sort of, as you said, aliyah neshama, all these other things, but it seems to be that seems a slightly different category, yeah. Unless you say that the mitzvah is either to your parent plus God together, in which case God is eternal, so therefore the mitzvah then never diminishes itself at all. And so that's what I want to kind of explore.
And in usage, you say, my parent, my father, my mother is nifter and so-and-such year. You don't say, Mr. So-and-so, it's your father or your mother.
Right.
That's common usage. So
And also, by the way, for example, some of the sources who say that you still have the obligation of honoring your parents, one of the examples they give is that when you mention your parents' name, you say Zichrono Livracha, as a form of honoring your parents. Because, listen, obviously you can no longer stand up for your parents, you can no longer feed them once they passed away. You can't do all the major things that you're supposed to do as honoring one's parents. So the rabbis have to come up with other things you can do. One of them is Zichron Livracha, and others, things like that. But it's because you have to actually come up with different things. Some people say, no, it's a different category now. It's no longer in the world of the 10 Commandments. It's a different, either spiritual or honoring the dead in general, or other things like that. In the Sefer Chinuch itself, you see this tension of both ideas. So if we go back to the Sefer Chinuch, it says, Misharshe mitzvazo, from the roots of this mitzvah. Sharu'ui lo la'adam sheyakir v'yigmol chesed l'mi she'asa imo tova. This is the ben adam l'chavero element. It is appropriate that a person should recognize and appreciate the kindness that someone else did for him. V'lo yeh naval, he shouldn't be a disgusting person, and a kafui tova, and someone who rejects gratitude, rejects good things, or is ungrateful to what people have done for him. Zo midah ra'ah me'usa. This is a disgusting habit or quality of tachlit lifnei Elokim v'anashim, both before God and for human beings. To be a kafui tova, to be someone who doesn't express gratitude to others, is a terrible, terrible thing. And you should know, you should always therefore place your heart, el libo ki ha'av'em hem sibat hayoto be'olam. They are the reasons why you exist in this world. It's not simply that they woke up for you at 3 a.m. and they fed you and they did all these things for you, which very often is where we learn how we're supposed to feed them and honor them and all these different things. It's not just that. You only exist in this world because of your parents. The mashal the rabbis say is if you were drowning in the ocean and someone came and saved you, you would be incredibly grateful to this individual. So it's a kal v'chomer. These parents saved you, they created you. So everything that you exist is that they gave to you. That's what being, it's a fundamental value in Judaism, is to be grateful, right? We say about Yehuda, right? Yehuda, we're Yehudim, Jews, it comes from the word gratitude. We express our gratitude. Jews are the thankfulness people, and part of the honoring one's parents is to thank them for our very life, for everything that we have. There's an interesting idea here, by the way. This mitzvah of honoring one's parents is very often connected to which other mitzvah? It's actually connected to usually two other mitzvot. One of them is Shabbat, which we'll talk about in a moment, because it follows Shabbat in the Ten Commandments. And the other mitzvah it's often connected to is Shiluach HaKen, right? Throwing away, shooing away a mother bird, if you wanted to take the egg of the mother bird. The reason why these two are connected is because they're the exact same reward. It's the only time in the Torah where the reward for a mitzvah is mentioned. It says that you will have a long life if you honor one's parents, and you have a long life if you shoo away that. So what do the rabbis learn from this? They say that one of these is the easiest of the easy mitzvot, and one of them is the hardest of the hard. And since they both have the exact same reward, we're supposed to learn from this that we're not supposed to evaluate the value of mitzvot. You never know, right? The easiest of these, the hardest and the hard are actually compared. Now, what's the easiest of the easy and what's the hardest of the hard? So the easiest of the easy, say the rabbis, is the shiluach haken, of pushing away the mother bird. Why is that an easy mitzvah? It's an easy mitzvah because we can understand it. It's a natural, you can understand a mother having pain to see her child taken away. And so therefore we can empathize with that. And so therefore it's just our natural inclination. We can appreciate that. And so therefore we can do it. The rabbis then say, however, with regards to honoring one's parents, on one level it is the easiest of the easy also, right? It's a natural thing to want to express gratitude to your parents and to love your parents. And they do all these things for you, presumably, hopefully, if it's a healthy, right, relationship, it's very easy to want to thank them and everything like that. And of course, the mitzvah exists not just in the world of Jews. Non-Jews also respect and love their parents as well, although certainly we see that it's an interesting phenomenon in the world today where we begin to celebrate the new and the everything that's always young and exciting. Actually, parents are a little bit pushed off and not celebrated in the same way that they are often in traditional societies. Judaism is opposed to that idea. By the way, just as an aside, my children have been making fun of me because it's Shir Omer, and so I grow my beard. And they point out that one of the reasons why Jews have beards, not just Shir Omer, one of the reasons we have beards in general is because your beard, not for most of you here, but me and Jerry can relate to this, exposes your age. Because you have the white or the whatever it is, it exposes your age. One of the things the Egyptian priests did is that they shaved all of their hair off their body, completely. And part of the reason is because in Egyptian theology, the priest was eternal. He lived forever. So you did not want to demonstrate any type of aging whatsoever because it sort of undermined the power that you had, because the power emanated from your eternal youth. And Judaism comes along and says, you know what? It's okay to be old. In fact, there's some advantages to being old in terms of wisdom and experience in life and all the like. We have a mitzvah, honoring the old. Emulate the old, in fact. Whereas that's opposed in Egyptian society. And so part of the ramifications of that is that in traditional Jewish society also, many of the men have beards. Part of it is to simply let nature take its course, meaning not to try to pretend to be something that you're not. Okay, coming back to this easiest of the easy. So on one hand, it's very easy to honor one's parents, but the rabbis also understood that this is an incredibly difficult mitzvah to do, because what you're doing at the end of the day is you are saying, I am totally and completely obligated. I exist only because of these people. It's all from them. Nothing of it is on my own. And the human nature is to want to say that I've done something on my own. I've created something on my own. I'm a self-made man. That's one of the things I once heard Rabbi Shalom Gold teach this with regards to Pirkei Avot. If you remember, there are, I think this is in the 5th chapter. Rebbe Omer, Ezehi derech yeshara sheyavo let me see if that's right. No. Okay. It's such small print, it's hard for me to see. The question is asked, what is the appropriate way that a person should pursue in life? What is the good path? And you'll know, I'm going to look for here for one more minute, and then I'll just say it outside if I don't see it. Okay, here it is. Rabbi Eliezer Omer. Okay, going back. There's 5 students of Rabbi Yochanan, and these are the great 5 students, right? They each have these incredible powers. He then asked them, Amar lehem, tz'uvr'u ezehi derech tova. What is the proper way, the good way, shebederech ba'adam, that a person should cling to in his life? Rabbi Eliezer says, ayin tova, a good eye. Right? A good eye probably means to see the good in others. Okay? Rabbi Yoshua Omer chaver tov, to have a good friend. Right? By the way, to have a good friend means that you're also a good friend very often. And you know what it means, and a friend is different than a shachen. Right? A friend is someone you go out and you develop a positive relationship. Rabbi Yosei Omer shachen tov, a good neighbor. You don't get to pick your neighbors always. Can you have a good relationship with someone who you didn't personally go and get to choose? Rabbi Shimon Omer haroeh et nolad, the person who sees the consequences, who sees the future. Rabbi Elazar Omer lev tov, a good heart. And the answer is a lev tov because it includes all of them. Then he asks, now what is the bad way that you should try to avoid in life? And each rabbi gives the exact opposite of what they said in the what is the good path. So if rather than a lev tov, a lev ra. Don't have a bad heart. Don't have an ayin ra, a bad eye. Don't have a, if you can't be a good friend, a chaver tov or a shachen tov. Right, a shachen ra, and so forth and so on. But Rabbi Shimon says, remember what he said before, haroeh et nolad, the person who sees the future. What would you think he should say? The person who can't see the future, or the person who is stuck in the past. But rather, what does he say? The quality that you should avoid in life is to be a love velo mishalem, the person who takes a loan and doesn't pay it back. Now, obviously, taking a loan and not paying it back is a bad thing. But is this like the slogan, right? This is the bumper sticker you would put on of the worst thing in the world to do. And why is it different in terms of the parallel nature to what he said previously, which is haroeh et nolad? So the answer, I think, is this. Haroeh et nolad is the person who sees, nolad means like the birth, that which comes from something, the consequences. But there's another way of understanding it as well. Haroeh et nolad could be, this is the good thing, the person who sees himself as nolad, as born. How else would you see yourself? Well, if you speak to some people, certainly this is something I see in America as well very often, is that there's a admiration, a glorification of what? The self-made man. The person who comes from nowhere, almost as if he's spontaneously created. The individual who has no parents, who has no one who's come before him, but he did everything on his own. However, in contrast to that, Judaism says, Ro'eh nolad, see yourself as born into this world, and as therefore a recipient of the people who have come before you. Right? You didn't create the car. Someone else created the car and built the car, and we're beneficiaries of that. And we're beneficiaries of electricity. We're beneficiaries of a whole amount of physical benefits that we all have. And we're also beneficiaries of a whole series of spiritual innovations that have taken place. We're beneficiaries of Abraham and Yaakov and Yitzchak, and all the way up to our parents. So what Rabbi Shimon is saying, the most important quality is to appreciate how much we've benefited from others, especially our parents, that we are spiritually inherited a tremendous amount from the generations that become for us. That's what he means by saying heroet and nolad, and therefore you can understand his what's the worst thing you can do is to take a loan and not pay it back. He's not talking money. The worst thing you can do is to take all that you've received from previous generations and then let it stop with you and decide, I'm not going to share it with the next generation. I'm not going to give anything over. That you're a link in the chain is what he's really saying. And the most important thing is to recognize that you are a recipient and then to also give it further. What the Sefer Chinuch therefore is saying is, even though this is an incredibly difficult thing to admit, it's very hard to admit that what I've created in this world, it's natural for us to think, what I've created in this world is because I have certain talents and I did hard work, and which is all true. But I was only in a position to be able to use my hard work and my talents and all these other things is because my parents laid the path as well as those before me. So that's sometimes hard to do because it requires a certain amount of humility and vulnerability to make that statement. So that's what the first thing the Sefer HaChinuch is saying, is that the mitzvah has to do with appreciating and giving thanks to your parents. That's a mitzvah ben adam lechavero, to appreciate that. He then goes on, however, and says, but it's not just that. We honor our parents also because they created us, and when we recognize that they created us, it also brings us closer to God, because we recognize God as the ultimate creator. In other words, part of the process of honoring one's parents is to bring us to an appreciation of our relationship with God. We see this, by the way, in a whole series of different ways inside the Torah itself. For example, take the concept of love. The concept of love develops over time in the Torah. It starts off really with almost like self-love, appreciation of a human being existing, and then it expands to the love between a husband and wife, whether it's Avram and Sarah, or Yitzchak and Rivka, Yaakov and Rachel. It extends then to having children, right? You then love children. As the Torah develops, we don't get to, for example, the love of your neighbor. By the way, the word re'ah is not just neighbor, it's, your beloved, meaning a close person. You don't have that until much later in the Torah, in Vayikra, right? And then what comes after that? Not until B'midbar do we get to love the ger, and we also then get love the eretz, and then finally, in Ve'et Hanan, with the Shema, we get V'hafta et Hashem Elokecha. In other words, the Torah understands that it may be difficult to instantly develop a sense of love of God. You have to appreciate what concept of love is. So you build it up. You use almost a model of your love with another individual to expand it to love, right? When you develop love with another individual, now maybe you know what it means in order to have that relationship with a stranger. And if you can then develop a love with a stranger, then you could develop love of an inanimate object like land. And if you could develop that type of love, it then gives you an appreciation of something you can't even see, which is God. Right? You need to develop skills in order to get to the next level. And so there's a famous story, for example, of Yaakov and Yosef. When they hadn't seen each other for 22 years, they hug each other, they kiss each other, and the Torah says, Yaakov's crying on the neck of Yosef, but it doesn't tell us what they're really doing. Rashi adds there what? He says that at that point in time, Yaakov decides to say the Shema. So all the commentaries ask, why in the world, after not seeing your son for 22 years, would you interrupt this reunion and say, now it's time to say Shema? You could say it 5 minutes later. You could have said it 5 minutes earlier. So the way it's understood is, it's not that it was the time to say Shema. In the Shema itself, it says you're supposed to love the Lord your God with all your might, right? With all your heart, with all your soul. So until he had that relationship with Yosef and the tears of that reunion and the power of, wow, that love between a father and son, now he gets it. He gets what that longing is and that love is and that closeness is and that joy, and that actually then helps him to have an appreciation of and love of God. So therefore, it switches over. So part of what the Sefer HaChinuch says in the second idea is that it's a mitzvah of ben adam lechavero to help us get to ben adam lemakom. It is ben adam lemakom. It's about loving God. But you have to first understand what that love is, and you have to understand how to honor God and you therefore have to have real practical ideas there. That's one of the great innovations, we spoke about this before, of Judaism. Judaism takes the theoretical and concretizes it, right? It takes the concept of love your God and says you're going to pray. It takes the concept of loving fellow human beings and you're going to give tzedakah. It takes grand ideas and it says you're going to build a sukkah and you're going to physically do stuff. I think I probably quoted once before Rabbi Riskin, who used to say that one of the problems of modern Jews is that they very often say, I feel Jewish in my heart. And he says that's maybe the reason why there's such bad heart disease amongst Jews, is because you should take a little bit of that feeling and concretize it and put it in your legs and walk to shul, put it in your hands, give tzedakah, and put on tefillin, all these different ideas. Okay. Once we've moved to the world of understanding the Sefer Chinuch, that it's both Ben Adam L'Chavero and Ben Adam L'Makom, we understand a lot of these machlokets much better, of the tshuva and of the step-parent, and right? If it's between you and God, so that's going to be permanent, always. If it's between you and another human being, Ben Adam L'Chavero, so then there might be times when it's at least a rabbinic level, maybe disappears altogether after it disappears. So those who hold that it's more permanent would suggest that it's connected parent to God as well. It also would explain, for example, why some say you have to honor any of your older brothers and sisters and not just your oldest, right? Because any of your brothers and sisters is honoring your parents because they care for their second and third and fourth, presumably as much as their first. But God appointed the oldest with a special role of being the Bechor, of being like representative of the parent. There's another way of understanding Ben Adam L'Chavero, and I just want to go there quickly. That's the second source sheet. That is Rav Hirsch. So he accepts this idea of Ben Adam L'Makom is the essence of the mitzvah, but he says it's not about learning to love God by honoring your parents, but it's something slightly different. His nuance, though, is very, very, very meaningful, I believe. If you see on the right-hand side where it says V12, verse 12, right? 12 is above, honor your mother and father. By the way, you see the continuation of the verse is what we've already spoken about. L'man yarichun yemecha, so that your days on this land will be long. So the knowledge and acknowledgement of God. He says it's all about God. It's all about God. He says that's what the Ten Commandments are about as well. Anochi, I'm the God who took you out of Egypt. Don't have any other false gods, all these other things. He says it's all about gaining knowledge of God. But he says there's two ways you can gain knowledge of God. There's two ways you can gain knowledge of anything. One is you can think about it, philosophically try to understand a topic, or two is to experience it. And what he's going to say is experiential is more powerful in this instance. So if you look at the fourth line, after the comma, fifth line, this knowledge and acknowledgement rests essentially on Yetziat Mitzrayim. In other words, he says, you want to know God? The way the Jewish people really came to know God is through the experience of Yetziat Mitzrayim, as it expressed at once by the addition of a Shir Hotzitra in the Anochi, right? In the first of the Ten Commandments, it says, I am the Lord your God. Why does it need to say, that took you out of the land of Egypt? So Rav Hirsch says, because we only know that God is our God because of the experience of Egypt, not sort of a philosophical God in the past. In this way, Rav Hirsch is actually disagreeing with the Rambam. The Rambam in the Mor Nevuchim says the best way to know God is not through experience. The best way to know God is to be a philosopher. Sit atop a mountain that has a very good Beit Midrash, right? And study all day long. And if you study philosophy and you study Aristotle and you study the Torah and all these different, you'll come to know God because it's just a natural way of understanding the world. You don't need any personal experiences. That's why, for example, the Rambam wrote a very famous letter to Ovadia. Ovadia was a convert. And Ovadia writes to the Rambam in his letter, he says, am I allowed to make the brachot of Asher Kiddushan B'Mitzvah Vitzivanu, that God commanded me to do X, Y, and Z. Or Asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chayei olam, that God gave me the Torah. Or all the mitzvot that say Elohei Avotenu, and the gods of my fathers. My fathers were not Jewish. God didn't give me the Torah. All these different things. Can I make those brachot? So he says, can I make those brachot? And the Rambam, in general, is incredibly sensitive to the needs of the convert. He has a whole series of halachot. It's worthwhile to look into. And when we get to the mitzvah, the Aftat Tegir, we'll see the Rambam very much. And this is a very important letter that he writes. And in the letter he writes to Ovadia the convert, he says, you are the son of Avraham. What makes you the son of Avraham? Avraham came to know God intellectually, philosophically, not experientially, right? God didn't reach down, although some will argue that he did. If you look at the Torah says God speaks to Avram and says, Lech lecha, that there's a relationship. But the Rambam almost ignores that. And he says, no, it's all about the Midrash. You know, the Midrash where it says Avram is walking and he sees a palace and he asks if there's light in the palace, then there must be a creator. There must be someone who illuminated the palace. So Avram is a philosopher, says the Rambam, and you are his son because you are a philosopher. You chose on your own, not through experience, but through knowledge and intellect and philosophy, to come to become a Jew. So therefore you can make all those brachot. Rav Hirsch is saying something different. He's saying it's not enough to be intellectually convinced that Judaism makes sense. You have to really experience it. That knowledge is what really works, because in the case of just trying to intellectually understand it, that led to idol worship. And he goes on, he says, not on the results of our research into nature, but in the actual events in history of our people by which God became revealed to us and made his will revealed to us, did God found our Jewish knowledge and acknowledging of him. That he directs our fate, and he goes on there, 2 or 3 lines down. And it was only the historical revelations of God in the history of the Jewish people which brought back the monotheistic idea to mankind for their understanding of nature and history. Yetziat Mitzrayim, therefore, in Matan Torah, these 2 experiences is what allows us to know God. Now, what's the connection to parenting? So if you look where it becomes italicized a little bit lower, but the knowledge and acknowledgement of historical facts depends solely on tradition. And tradition depends solely on the faithful transmission by parents to children and on the willing acceptance by children from the hand of their parents. So that the continuance of God's whole great institution of Judaism rests entirely on the theoretical and practical obedience of children to parents, and kavod et av ve'em is the basic condition for the eternal existence of the Jewish nation. In other words, if we want to experience God in this world, you have to hear about our history. And the only way you can hear about our history is through your parents, is through the previous generation. Although there are times, for example, right, there's a machloket about if your parents and your Rebbe's house are being burned down, you know, and you can only save one, who are you to save? Not lives, but the house. Right, if it's a Rebbe, if it's a Rebbe Muhavak, that's who you save. Now, why would you say that? Don't I have an obligation of honoring my parents? Well, if you hold by Rav Hirsch, the reason why you have an obligation of honoring your parents is because they are a conduit to get to God. They are a conduit to get to all of Judaism. They give you all the knowledge you need. But in the case of the Rebbe Muvak, he takes that role. And that's why you're allowed to ignore your parents if they tell you not to do a mitzvah. Because it's not about honoring your parents. It's about honoring your parents so you appreciate this relationship of transmission and tradition. And so therefore you honor your parents to remind you constantly of the need and the thirst you should have of trying to get the truth. And your parents are repositories of that truth, that they go back further and further and further, all the way to Adam, right? Eventually you get back to that source. The next page. Without this bond, the chain of generations is broken in the Jewish past, is lost to the future. The Ten Commandments indicates that the importance of parents allows the Torah to say, to honor your parents so that your days of your life will be long, that I am the Lord your God. Meaning, he actually connects it to the continuation of the verse. Why does it say, I am the Lord your God after honor your parents? Because you only come to know God through honoring of your parents. I want to throw out one last idea before we conclude, which is also connected, I think, to seeing this as a mitzvah ben adam l'makom. I mentioned previously that you don't have to follow your parents if they tell you not to do a mitzvah. Where do we learn that from? The juxtaposition of this mitzvah with the mitzvah of Shabbat. Right? If your parents tell you don't keep Shabbat, you can ignore them because they come right after, because they're connected to one another. But you could ask a question. That could be after any mitzvah. Right? You could have put this idea of honoring your mother and father right after not to have any false gods. If your parents tell you to have false gods, you ignore them. Why does it come right after specifically Shabbat? So the Kli Yakar points out that Shabbat and honoring one's parents are intimately linked in a whole series of different ways. For example, there are 3 times, yeah.
So, Hadash of the Hadash sometimes Tishmon is kind of juxtaposed.
In Vayikra. In Vayikra, they actually are in the same verse, just as they're here in the order. In Yitro, in Yitro they have the order right, and then in Vayikra, but what the Kli Yakar points out, it's not simply that they're juxtaposed there. Every time Shabbat is introduced, I should say, because Shabbat is introduced more than that. Every time honoring your parents is introduced, right, but no, I mean, okay, but the Kli Yakar points these three times where the obligation of honoring parents exists or fearing parents exists, the mitzvah Shabbat is also introduced. That they always are somehow actually linked together. And by the way, some have suggested there's a 4th time as well, because Shabbat is first introduced in Mara, at the waters, the bitter waters, and we don't know what mitzvot are introduced. The Midrash says that there are 3 mitzvot introduced there, Shabbat, Dinim, and the Midrash says Kivud Av. The Rashi says there were 3 mitzvot, Dinim, Shabbat, and Para Aduma. And so, by the way, I hate so I remember once giving a whole Shir on why Rashi would say Para Aduma. Why is that one of the 3 major mitzvot that God, these are the first mitzvot that God's really giving the Jewish people. Shabbat, the idea of setting up courts, and then why is Para Aduma so important? And I gave this incredibly long and complicated and I thought brilliant Shir. And then I read something that said it's probably a scribal error because the Midrash says it's Dinim, Shabbat, and Kibud Av. And over time, how would you begin to write Kibud Av? Chaf Aleph. And no doubt, over time, what probably happened is people started writing Kaf Aleph, and that Kaf begins to look like a Pei. And therefore, it was then probably brought out that someone wrote the Pei Aleph as Para Aduma. So it may be that Rashi really felt Para Aduma. It would save my shir that I gave, but it's also very possible that the Midrash is correct and it's simply Kivud Av. So, but whatever the case is, Shabbat and honoring one's parents are always connected. What are we supposed to learn from that? So the Kli Yakar says it's connected to this concept of going back in time to Adam, right? That we go all the way back to Adam with regards to Shabbat, creating of the world, and with honoring parents, he's our ultimate parent, and there's a whole series of lessons you learn once you say that you're connected to Adam, right? Judaism is about vertical and horizontal relationships. So when you have a vertical relationship to Adam and Chava, what does that do to your horizontal relationships? It means that you're all brothers and sisters, right? So therefore, as the Mishnah in Sanhedrin talks about, we now have a more positive relationship with the whole world because we all come from the exact same father and mother. So our horizontal relationship our vertical affects our horizontal and vice versa. Of course, the head of that vertical is actually God. God created Adam. And so therefore, if we go back to Adam, we also go back to God. So that's the Kli Yakar's understanding. There's another connection, I think, between Shabbat and honoring one's parents as well. When we spoke about Shabbat, we spoke about how Shabbat is God thrusting us the challenge of continuing the creation, right? It's not the end of creation. We're responsible for day 8, which is the next week. God gives us Shabbat in order to sort of rest and recalculate so that we can go out and continue God's creation in the next week and for the rest of the world. We create the world, right? Adam and Chava, the whole world we have today, is created from what they did after Shabbat and then moving forward. So Shabbat and parenting are also the same idea. It's all about understanding the power of creation. Shabbat is about creating the world, and parenting is about creating the world. And you may question whether or not I have the power that God has to create the world, and God gives us an actual mashal, parenting. He says, you have the same power of creation that I have. I created a human being. You have the power to create a human being as well and guide that human being, just as I guide you with Torah and the like. You now give Torah and Har Sinai to your children. In other words, it's one of the most powerful ways of emulating God and following through on God's ways. And so therefore, again, we have it's not an either or of, is it a Ben Adam L'Chavero or Ben Adam L'Makom, but rather in this case now, we learn from the Ben Adam L'Makom, we see how God behaved with God's creations, and we now learn how to become a Ben Adam L'Chavero. We learn how to become better parents from that model, and so we honor our parents in order to, in a sense, inspire ourselves with the same ability to be creative, just as God is, and to actually create the world that comes following. Chag Sameach. Tonight we have Yom Ha'atzmaut.